Now, secondly, Job sought the consecration of his family. Job was not just knowing what was going on in their lives and their scores and how they were doing. Job sought the consecration of his family. He prayerfully sought that each member of his family, notice what it says in the middle of verse 5. So it was when the days of feasting had run their course. He's tracking with them. Look at the next element. That Job would send and sanctify them. What does sanctification mean? It's a big word that means useful to God. A sanctified person is useful to God. A sanctified life is an instrument in God's hands. The greatest thing we can do is pray that our children be useful to God. How do you do that? Pray like Job, that they be sanctified. It says that Job would send and sanctify them. That those words, send and sanctify them, speaks of his high priestly role at the head of his family. He went to God seeking their purity before the Lord. Now, I just need to mention this. We need to start, and now, by the way, these kids are grown up, but at any age, we need to start looking and seeing our children and praying for our children from a biblical perspective. Now, I know that some of you this will bother, but I'll just say it anyway. I hear believers at Calvary talking about their children. And they'll say this, and they'll say that, and they'll say this. Almost always, when they're telling me this, I'll step in, I'll say, I just have two questions. Number one, are they Christians? Do you know if they're a believer? And they'll go yes or no. And then I'll say, do you believe what they're doing is sin? I hear weaknesses, struggles, I hear bad choices. What does God call living with someone? Fornication. Do you know why we have hardly any power in our prayers? Because we're excusing their behavior. We are not holding up God's standard and saying, that is wrong. You cannot stay with her at my house. That is sin. Now you say, that's hard. Yeah, who is going to stand up for God? If you don't, how can you be an example to them? If you excuse, if you condone, if you allow their sinful behavior to persist. Now I'm talking about believers. You have an unsaved person, everything they do is sin, God says. Even the plowing of the wicked is sin. If someone claims to be a believer, look what Job said. Job would send and sanctify them. In a practical way, dads, it is you that needs to know well enough your boys and girls so that you can stand with them in prayer, you can seek their sanctification, and sanctification means being useful to the Lord. And as dads, we need to pray and seek and ask the Lord to make our children instruments He can use. Did you know God desires us to be sanctified? Do you know the word sanctify is the word from which also we get the word hagiazo, hagias, to be holy? Another way of saying sanctification is to be holy, to be set apart for God. And that's not just for priests or buildings, it's for people. Set apart for God. And that's what we need to pray for in their lives. Well, basically, the scriptures say that Job was one who constantly prayed for the sanctification of his children. In practical terms, that means we need to be the ones that tell them when they're out of line. We need to be the ones that say, you know what, I love you, you're wonderful, you will always be my child, but the choice you're making right now, God calls sin. And that's hard, but that is godly parenting. To say, well, yeah, I guess that's your choice. You have to define, are they a believer or an unbeliever? If they're an unbeliever, then everything they're doing, it's sin. But if they're a believer, they're choosing to sin. And if we're a believer, we need to tell them, you are going the wrong way. Job sanctified his children. The scriptures tell us that if they're immodest, we tell them they're immodest. If they're headed towards sin, we tell them they're headed towards sin. And as dads, we're also husbands. And Paul told us in Ephesians 5, we're supposed to seek not only our children's sanctification, but in the chapter prior, our wife, her sanctification. A husband is supposed to be prayerfully partnering with his wife that they together be the most sanctified, useful instruments in the parenting of their children. So Paul says that we are supposed to be those who sanctify and cleanse with the washing of water by the word, both our wives as well as our children. Well, do we care for our daughters and sons and wives' consecration?